is it's going to be helpful, right? I mean, on the AP test, there's a combination of skills, and the skills are analyzing documents and utilizing those documents and writing essays and thinking and connecting things. Those are the skills. And then there's also knowledge, right? And you can't beat knowledge, right? I mean, you can't use the skills if you don't know anything, right? So we try to reinforce as much of the factual knowledge as we can. One last thing, and I probably should have just incorporated this into your book, but it's 10 documents to remember. And given the AP test did turn 2 years ago towards a more skilled-oriented test, where you have to prove that you can analyze documents and incorporate them into either whatever, an essay or even a multiple choice question, answering a multiple choice question. So I thought to myself, 10 documents that I think are quintessential documents, right? Now, I don't know where I got this. I mean, I probably looked at other sources where, but these are the documents, and I listed them in chronological order. And then under each one of them is quotations from them. So if you are writing an essay or something, there's short essays, long essays, and a DBQ. But if you are writing an essay and somehow or another you can incorporate something from another document, the AP will think you're smart, right? And you'll get a better score on your essay. I mean, one thing about the essays on the test that you take for the AP, they are far more impressed by you knowing anything than we are. I mean, look, we just wrote an essay on the progressive error, but we've been talking about the progressive error, right? And I gave you stuff on the progressive error. And I told you basically exactly what the question was going to be. And the day before that, we actually brainstormed that. So how impressed should I have been that you knew what the new nationalism was? I mean, of course you should have. But the AP is going to be more impressed because you don't know what the questions are going to be. And, and if you know it, that's one thing. If you can use it, it's another. And that's an attempt to do that. Now, some of you came in, and I have books, and I know this is I have books that are commercially made books. You can, if you want to sign any of these books out and study from them, you can feel free to take them. A couple people asked me, what do I think is the best ones? These, I've never taken the AP test, I don't know. I do know that Princeton's a big name, in review books, and so is Barron's. This Princeton is a newer thing, it probably has the new test, and one of the things they have is practice tests. Now, practice tests are a good thing to do. I'm going to give you one that has more APS type questions as a duplicated copy. But it kind of, what am I going to do? How am I going to study? Am I going to study, well, let me do 50 practice questions or 25 practice questions. Which ones don't I know? Maybe I'll look up the answer, right? Some of those books have the answers, why the right answers. Like these books are old. Fawn was mocking them because there's at the back of it a floppy disk, right? So these books are old, but they have like a 246-page comprehensive review that you could refer to, when you're studying. So feel free to borrow any of those. Put your name, and if there's more, if we run out, I have more in the room. I just couldn't carry them all down. These are the only ones I could carry. Okay. So that's an overview of direction. And so when we come back on Tuesday, we'll have a tangible kind of review for the AP test. I'll think of something to do, in terms of review, and then we'll do it. Whether it's the first era chronologically, whether it's something about the Reagan administration that I want you to know. We'll just do something every time we convene, some kind of study. Now today, let's go quickly to the advanced placement thing, and I'll go really fast, right? The advanced placement test for Monday or Tuesday. We're probably leaning more towards Tuesday now. And so on this test, it is ultimately largely about two things, progressivism and World War I. In terms of progressivism is about change and reform and about government. So if you think about the nature of progressivism, what the progressives were about was kind of ameliorating the worst abuses in the world of the city and the world of the factory. But crucial to kind of fixing the problems that had emerged because of industrialization and urbanization is government. So what the progressives wanted to do is use government to fix problems, right? And we kind of debated what the nature of their objectives were. Did they want to use government to fix problems, to preserve things the way that they were, to go back to the past? Was this a radical movement? Was this a conservative movement? You know, we debated those things. And then we talked a little bit about where it came from. And what we said was that the idea of the progressive movement comes from a lot of sources. One of them is the populist, right? The populist. And the populists contribute to progressivism the idea of government, an active government, right? The populists wanted government to work for the people, right? Instead of working for business. So they wanted an active government that would work for the people. You know, another source of kind of the roots of progressivism was the social gospel. Now, the social gospel was kind of a religious movement. And what did it argue? What did the advocates of the social gospel argue? Did anybody remember? I mean, gospel means good news. Go ahead, Raymond.
Charity?
Well, yes. You know, that's part of it. Go ahead, DePaul.
Like Christians were like obligated to help the poor?
Yes, that it was a Christian obligation to kind of work towards eliminating the sources of poverty. The social gospel goes against the idea that poverty is sin, right? So, you know, the Puritan work ethic that the Protestant work ethic or Puritan work ethic argued on some level that poverty is a sign of decadence, that if you work hard, you can get ahead. The social gospel is a recognition that poverty might be a function of circumstance. And therefore, it's an obligation of Christians to help the less fortunate, not to scorn them. And certainly that's progressivism. You know, certainly that's progressivism. Who were the Muckrakers? I mean, they were journalists. Tell me, Raymond, who were the Muckrakers?
They dug up all the dirty
Muck,
secrets,
right? Yeah, that's it.
all the dirty secrets of various industries.
So the Muckrakers were journalists that wrote about problems.
The problems inherent
In society. And can you identify anybody that we associated with muckraking?
Upton Sinclair?
Upton Sinclair. What was the name of his muckraking novel? Go ahead, DePaul.
The Jungle.
The Jungle. And what was that book about? There is a question on the test, yes.
Was it about the meatpacking industry?
It was about the meatpacking industry. And just to follow it up, because there's questions on the test about this, what piece of legislation is directly attributed in the Roosevelt administration? Go ahead, Jesse. Well, Pure Food and Drug, as well as Meat Inspection Act, right? That were both directly attributable to muckraking. Who else was a muckraker besides Upton Sinclair? Who else do we associate as a muckraking journalist? Hey, was muckraking true? Was the articles that were published by the muckraking accurate and true? Or were they embellished? They were true. And so it distinguishes muckraking from yellow journalism, in which the articles that the yellow journalists published were embellishments, expansions, stretching the truth, sensationalization, right? Whereas muckraking was sensationalization, but it was true. Oh, who was Jacob R.I.I.S., Jacob Riis? What book did he write, do you recall?
It was the one about the other side or something.
How the Other Half Lived, which is considered to be kind of muckraking photography, right? Because it was a book of pictures of the squalor of the slums, how the other half lives. I mean, Riis could maybe be considered a muckraker. Certainly Ida Tarbell, that's on our list of famous women, who was one of the kind of premier muckraking journalists of the time, who published articles in those magazines that circulated weekly, that people bought inexpensively. Ida Tarbell, Lincoln Steffens are also people that we associate with muckraking. You know, one of the biggest crusades of the progressive era was prohibition. right? And we talked a little bit about prohibition, and we mentioned some of the organizations, like the Women's Christian Temperance Movement and the Anti-Saloon League, that pushed for prohibition. We did make the point today that the final push for prohibition was, as a result of World War I, was an anti-German sentiment, a fear, a part of the propaganda that was being used to promote, supporting World War I. Now, we said that the progressives expected government to take action. And so there were challenges associated with that. And one of the challenges was that government was corrupt at every level, was inefficient, at a number of levels. So one of the things, or some of the things the progressives wanted to do, was to clean up government and make it more efficient. And so we said that part of progressivism was actually reforming government so that government could address the problems in society. And we've talked about, some of the things that the progressives tried to do. Initiative, referendum, recall, right, were all reforms that the progressives sought to make government more responsive to the people. What was, for fun, what was the initiative? We mentioned the initiative as one of the things that the progressives wanted to do. Go ahead, Gabrielle.
Isn't that the one where you put the problems directly on the ballot and the voters cast?
With the initiative, the people can directly address problems. And so initiative is connected with referendum, where people can vote on those problems. Now, once government was, more responsive to the people, then the progressives wanted government to be more efficient, particularly on the city level. Remember we talked about the Galveston model, where elected officials were replaced with professional management. And one of the things that the progressives wanted was city government, at least, to kind of be more associated with professional management. That the people that would work in cities would no longer be elected or appointed hacks and henchmen, but professionally trained managers who would be able to deliver the services that people needed. And this comes to light in the aftermath of the Galveston hurricane, and it becomes the standard for progressives. Oh, incidentally, scientific management was something that the progressives advocated for, and that was the idea of breaking down human tasks into pieces and analyzing the pieces of those tasks and how humans move and how systems move and trying to improve it. The person that was associated with that was somebody named Frederick Taylor, right? So you might see his name on the test. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire was associated with what issue that progressive reformers championed. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, what issue? Go ahead, Gabrielle.
Working conditions.
Yeah, working conditions and, compensation for injuries on the job. Remember, I think it was 141 women died in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, many of them leaping to their deaths from windows that were 10 stories above the streets of New York, and there were locked fire escapes that they could not get access to. And we made a list of the kind of causes that the progressive reformers championed on the state level. Workman's compensation, working conditions, for number of hours, child labor, etc. Then we talked about progressivism on the national level, and we suggested that both, or I should say both, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson were all considered to be progressive presidents. Theodore Roosevelt is the first president of the period. I mean, he ascends to the presidency upon the death of McKinley in 1901. Eventually, Theodore Roosevelt's kind of moniker that he uses to describe his administration is the fair deal. And if you think about that, you know, the fair deal kind of embodies, you know, maybe the progressive ideal. Progressivism, you know, I remember we talked about progressivism being, you know, kind of this response of an urban upper middle class that feels kind of frustrated by what they see happening in society. And they say, okay, we don't want socialism, and we don't want, you know, kind of political bossism and monopolies to dominate society. So we want to make some kind of modest reforms. We want people to get the fair deal, right? You know, we want the fair deal. If we give people the fair deal, they won't be attracted to socialism, right? So we want the fair deal. And remember, we said that if we look at Roosevelt's fair deal, it can be broken into the 3 C's, right? Corporations, consumerism, and conservation. Corporations, consumerism, and conservation. In terms of corporations, it was about the regulation of trusts, right? The big monopolies had emerged by 1900, and the question is, what should we do about them? Roosevelt's answer is that the trusts needed to be held accountable for kind of the fair deal, right? They needed to be held accountable for, you know, abusing, you know, circumstances in society, and that Roosevelt is going to argue that the trusts are okay, big business is okay, but they had to be responsible. The 2 examples of this are the Northern Securities case and the 1902 coal strike. In the Northern Securities case, what does Roosevelt do that represents such a big departure from the past? What does he do? Go ahead, Raymond.
He doesn't simply take the business.
Well, in the Northern, yeah, and that's in the coal strike mostly, but in the Northern Securities case, he files suit against the Northern Securities Company to break it up. It's, using the Sherman Antitrust Act to legitimately break up a company. Now, remember, the reason that Roosevelt did that is he thought that the Northern Securities Company was an abusive trust, not because it was a trust. So the purpose of antitrust legislation, the purpose of breaking up trust, was not to break them up, but to force them to behave, right? You know, again, back to the square deal. And then, Raymond, you are right about the coal strike. In the coal strike, Roosevelt isn't really going to necessarily side with labor as much as he doesn't side fully with business. I mean, in every other time when the government intervened, they intervened on behalf of the owners of business. Roosevelt is going to argue he's intervening on behalf of the public at large, right? You know, not necessarily for the worker, not necessarily for the company, but for stability. Some of you argue that pretty well in your papers, making an argument that Roosevelt's intervention in the coal strike was an example of his conservatism, because what he wanted was stability and order and the power of government. And it's exemplified there. And several of you made pretty nice arguments. I mean, I don't know if anybody in this room did. Somebody did. You know, in the papers that they read. So, okay, you know, we talked about Roosevelt. We talked about the coal strike. The Elkins and Hepburn Acts, what were they associated? They're part of Roosevelt's agenda, but what industry were the Hepburn and Elkins Acts designed to regulate that was so important to this time period? Yes? Yes. They were both intended to regulate the railroad industry. In terms of conservation, Roosevelt is a conservationist, but he is not an environmentalist. And oh, incidentally, who did we associate with environmentalism and not conservationism? We associated somebody. The AP loves this guy. I mean, there was one of the long essays last year was on environmentalism in the 1970s, which was just a disaster for the home team here at Gateway. I mean, because I don't think if I would have taught this class for 2 years straight, I would have talked about environmentalism in the 1970s. Although, I mean, you know, Silent Spring and Rachel Carson and all of the things that are associated with environmentalism is Big thing was a pretty extensive essay, but nevertheless, in terms of environmentalism, what name do we associate? You should remember this, AP loves this guy. What name do we associate with environmentalism? Yes.
Are you talking about John Doe?
Yes, I am. John Muir, who founded the Sierra Club. What name do we associate with conservationism? Well, Teddy Roosevelt, yes, but who was his buddy?
Gifford Pinchot.
Gifford Pinchot, our second favorite name in AP history. Our first is legal tender Coxey. I mean, it's hard to beat legal tender Coxey. But Gifford Pinchot is up there, right? So Gifford Pinchot is a conservationist. John Muir is an environmentalist. What's the difference? And Teddy Roosevelt is a conservationist, correct? What's the difference?
Conservationism is just kind of conserving the resources used by businesses
For,
like sport.
well, maybe
Not
sport,
necessarily
but for
sport,
use.
But for use.
For human use, for human present use or human future use. So conservation was the idea that we are going to, it's kind of a progressive idea, that we are going to intelligently and efficiently manage the natural environment for the benefit of people now and into the future. What's the difference? What is environmentalism? Yes.
Environmentalism just wanted to strictly refuse to allow business to use any kind of natural resources.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, but I mean more ideologically. Go ahead.
They just wanted to conserve it for the good of nature.
Yes, they just want nature for nature's sake, and that would entail not really using it, but protecting it, shielding it. And Roosevelt likes the outdoors, but he is a conservationist, right? And he is going to, kind of champion conservation. He'll be associated with, I read an article in the paper recently, his great-grandson came to Pittsburgh to talk about saving something in Alaska, some kind of conservation. So I mean, this is a lot of things, but, amongst the conservationists, and even environmentalists, Roosevelt holds a lot of sway. Well, all right, we know that Roosevelt kind of dramatically leaves office in 1908, and that when he does, he announces that he is not going to seek another term, even though he could. He is wildly popular with a lot of people, but increasingly the old guard in his party is less than enamored with Roosevelt when he decides to leave. He handpicks his successor. His handpicked successor is William Howard Taft, and Taft is elected with Roosevelt's support and blessing, and Roosevelt claims that Taft is going to follow his policies. We know that Taft inherits from Roosevelt the problem that emerged between the progressives, or the insurgents in the party, and the old guard. And that Taft is less than capable of handling those problems, and it results in basically Roosevelt reneging on his support of Taft. I mean, Roosevelt is eventually going to return and challenge Taft for the the Republican nomination for the presidency in 1912, largely because he argues that Taft is not following his policies. When Roosevelt is denied the nomination, in his view, against the will of the rank and file of the Republican Party, he contributes to beginning his own party, which is the Progressive Party. One of the things that's mentioned about the Progressive Party is that Jane Addams, 2 Ds, the AP loves her too. What do we associate Jane Addams with? Jane Addams, 2 Ds, yes. The Whole House and the Settlement House movement, which was also one of the roots of progressivism. Jane Addams put Roosevelt's name in nomination for the progressive thing, and that was considered to be a big symbolic kind of gesture of the importance of women. So Jane Addams moves that Roosevelt be nominated for the Progressive Party, but she can't even vote for it. Think about that. I mean, that's an amazing travesty. We are so hard on, other people in the world that don't seem to give, females equal rights. But here was Jane Addams, who had accomplished so much, couldn't vote in 100 years ago, in the United States. So, she put his name in nomination, but she couldn't vote for him. Now, we said in the election of 1912 that it got down to a contest between Roosevelt and the New Nationalism and Wilson and the New Freedom. Now, we have talked about the New Nationalism versus the New Freedom Obviously, there'll be questions on the test about that. We talked about that extensively. The new nationalism, the idea of regulating trust, the new freedom, the idea of breaking up trust. All right? Now, we know that we don't know if the public's election of Wilson was an endorsement of the new freedom or it was a function of the division between Taft and Roosevelt. But what we do know this, when Wilson was elected to the presidency in 1912 and eventually inaugurated in 1913, he is going to be one of the most successful presidents in American history in terms of accomplishing what he wants to accomplish. And what he wants to accomplish, at least initially in his presidency, is attacking the triple wall of privilege. The triple wall of privilege was tariffs, banking, and trusts. Right? Tariffs, banking, and trusts. And so we talked about how Roosevelt, in his attack of tariffs, in promoting the Underwood tariff, is actually going to appear before Congress himself. Something that no one since Thomas Jefferson had actually done in trying to appeal over the heads of the people. And we know that the Underwood tariff that was passed lowered tariffs and also provided for the first time in American history an income tax. What amendment of the Constitution allowed the income tax? Does anybody besides the instructor remember? Diksha, I knew you would know this.
Was it the 19th?
It was not. So I was confident that you would know this, but now I was, yes, go ahead.
16th.
He's a brilliant man. It's the 16th Amendment. Alan, all right, Alan, what was the 17th Amendment? Yes, what was the 17th?
It changed the elections of senators.
Direct election of senators. What was the 18th?
Prohibition.
That's right. What was the 19th?
Mid-suffrage.
Those are considered to be the progressive amendments. 16, 17, 18, 19, right, are considered to be the progressive amendments. It's almost like what was happening with the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th Amendment is the Constitution was being amended to accommodate the city and the factory, right? I mean, if you think about the constitutional amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th were the constitutional adjustment for the abolition of slavery. The 16th, 17th, and 16, 17, 18, and 19 is the constitutional adjustment for the city and the factory, progressivism. Okay, so we talked about this. We talked about the Federal Reserve Act. We said the Federal Reserve Act is the most far-reaching piece of legislation between the Civil War and World War II. Well, maybe not World War II, the New Deal. And it provided for the Federal Reserve System, which was the third bank of the United States, a blend of public and private ownership. I must say that on the test also, that some of you used the Federal Reserve very effectively. You know, I mean, you know, some of you stumbled through, but some of you used the Federal Reserve Act, you know, kind of thoughtfully to make an argument either for Wilson being conservative or liberal. There are a few questions of the Clayton Antitrust Act. The Clayton Antitrust Act are going to make certain things associated with trust or uncompetitive practices to be illegal, the Clayton Antitrust Act. And it also is something that Samuel Gompers referred to as labor's Magna Carta, because it stated that labor was not a commodity. Here is a tip for you. There is a question on the test about a Wilson appointee